There are worse things than death, Jonathan Harker was learning. Worse even than the knowledge that you're going to die. There's the slow realization that you're already dead in every way that matters, that the world has gone on without you, that no one knows where you are or what's happening to you in this castle of shadows perched at the edge of civilization. There's the understanding that your captor sees you not as a person but as a tool, a resource to be used and discarded when your usefulness expires. And there's the moment, the precise terrible moment, when you discover you're not alone in your imprisonment, that others share this stone cage, beautiful and terrible and hungry, and that they've been waiting so long, so very long, for fresh blood to enter these halls. Jonathan had 3 revelations during his second day in Castle Dracula. First, that his host cast no reflection in mirrors and recoiled from the crucifix like it was flame. Second, that every door leading to freedom was locked, every window barred or too high, every possible escape route sealed as thoroughly as a tomb. And third, that the Count had very specific plans for London, for England, for bringing his ancient darkness to the modern world, and Jonathan's expertise was helping him do it. But the 4th revelation, the one that came in the depths of night when he explored where he shouldn't have gone, when 3 women with eyes like dying stars surrounded him and whispered promises in voices like honey and poison, that revelation would change everything. Dawn came late to the Carpathian peaks, the sun having to climb above the eastern mountains before its light could reach the castle's high walls, and Jonathan woke from dreams of drowning to find his room bathed in grey pre-morning gloom. He'd slept fitfully, every sound in the ancient fortress jolting him toward wakefulness, the settling of stones, the wind moaning through battlements, and once, unmistakably, footsteps in the corridor outside his door, slow and measured, pausing at his threshold before moving on. He'd lain rigid beneath the covers, the crucifix clutched in one hand, waiting for the door to open, but it hadn't, and eventually the footsteps had receded and the silence had returned and exhaustion had pulled him back under. Now, in the strengthening light, the terrors of the previous night seemed almost manageable, almost explicable. He'd been exhausted, overwrought, his imagination inflamed by the strange journey and the local superstitions. The Count was certainly eccentric, the castle undeniably isolated and unsettling, but perhaps things could be rationalized in daylight, addressed through straightforward conversation. Jonathan rose, washed with water from the basin that had been provided, and began his morning routine, the familiar ritual of shaving offering a small measure of normalcy. He'd set up his shaving mirror on the dresser, the small traveling mirror that had accompanied him across Europe, and was stropping his razor when the door opened without a knock and the Count entered. "Good morning, my friend," Dracula said, his voice as cultured and warm as if they were meeting in a London gentleman's club rather than a medieval fortress. "I trust you slept well. I regret I could not join you for breakfast. I have already attended to my own needs, but I thought we might begin our business discussions early. There is much to review, and I am eager to understand every detail of the properties I am acquiring." Jonathan had turned at the greeting, razor in hand, and caught sight of the mirror's reflection. He could see himself clearly, his own face still showing traces of the fear and exhaustion of the night before, the room behind him, the early morning light from the window, all rendered faithfully in the small circle of glass. But where the Count stood, barely 3 feet away, there was nothing. Empty space. The mirror showed the room as if Dracula didn't exist, as if Jonathan was speaking to air and emptiness. He'd frozen, the razor suddenly heavy in his hand, and the Count had followed his gaze, had seen what he was looking at, and for just an instant something had flickered across those aristocratic features, something cold and ancient and utterly inhuman. Then the Count had smiled, had moved with that supernatural speed, and suddenly the mirror was in his hand, plucked from the dresser so quickly Jonathan hadn't seen him reach for it. "Mirrors," Dracula said softly, "are vanity, are they not? Unnecessary affectations. We should concern ourselves with substance, not reflection. You have no need of this here." And he'd walked to the window, opened it, and thrown the mirror out into the void, the small circle of glass tumbling away into the morning air, falling and falling until it struck the rocks hundreds of feet below with a sound like a distant bell. Jonathan had stood speechless, the casual violence of the gesture combining with the impossible evidence of what the mirror had shown, or rather hadn't shown, and the Count had turned back to him with an expression of mild concern. "Forgive me, my friend, but I startled you and you cut yourself." He gestured to Jonathan's neck, and Jonathan had reached up automatically, feeling the thin line of blood where his shock had caused the razor to nick his skin. The Count's eyes had fixed on that blood with an intensity that made Jonathan's skin crawl, had tracked the small rivulet as it ran down toward his collar, and his lips had parted slightly, showing the edge of those two sharp teeth. Then Dracula had mastered himself with visible effort, had stepped backward, had put distance between them, and when he'd spoken again his voice had been strained, tight with some tremendous suppressed hunger. "You should tend to that. Even small wounds can fester if neglected. I will wait for you in the library. Join me when you are ready. We have much work to do." He'd left quickly, almost fleeing, and Jonathan had pressed his hand to his neck, feeling his pulse hammering against his palm, knowing with absolute certainty that he'd just witnessed his host restraining himself from attacking, from feeding, that only some tremendous self-control had prevented Dracula from falling on him like an animal. He'd cleaned the cut with trembling hands, dressed himself carefully, and spent several minutes simply breathing, trying to force his mind to work rationally. The Count cast no reflection. That was impossible, yet he'd seen it, or rather hadn't seen it. The Count had reacted to the sight of blood with barely restrained violence, with hunger so naked and obvious that Jonathan couldn't pretend not to understand what it meant. And the Count had thrown away his only mirror, had eliminated the one object that could provide evidence of his unnatural nature. These were facts, observable, undeniable, and they pointed to a conclusion that Jonathan's rational mind still struggled to accept even as his instinct screamed its truth. His host was not human, had never been human, or had ceased to be human so long ago that only the appearance remained, a shell wrapped around something predatory and ancient. The word the old woman in the market had spoken came back to him, Nosferatu, and with it came fragmentary memories of stories, of folklore he dismissed as peasant superstition, tales of the undead who walked after death, who fed on blood, who cast no reflection because they had no soul. Vampires. The word felt absurd even thinking it, like something from a Gothic novel, yet what other explanation fit the evidence? The library, when he found it, was vast and impressive, lined floor to ceiling with books in dozens of languages, many of them so old their leather bindings had crumbled to fragments. The Count sat at a massive table strewn with maps and documents, and when Jonathan entered he looked up with a smile that seemed deliberately calculated to appear warm and welcoming. "Ah, Mr. Harker, excellent. Come, sit. Let us speak of London, of your marvelous modern city. I have studied it for years through books and newspapers, but nothing compares to the knowledge of someone who lives there, who walks its streets and knows its rhythms. Tell me everything." The hours that followed had a quality of unreality, of nightmare masquerading as normalcy. They discussed property law and land transfer, reviewed the documents Jonathan had brought, and the Count asked question after question about London's geography, its population, its districts, and neighborhoods. He wanted to know about shipping schedules, about which areas of the city were most crowded, about the habits of working people versus the wealthy, about everything from the layout of Whitechapel to the social calendar of Mayfair. His knowledge was encyclopedic but strangely dated, as though he'd studied extensively but not recently, and he absorbed Jonathan's answers with an intensity that went beyond mere business interest. "I wish to move among your people unnoticed," Dracula explained when Jonathan had hesitantly asked why such details mattered. "I am a stranger to England, to its modern customs. I do not wish to appear foreign or attract attention. Anonymity is essential for my purposes. I must blend seamlessly into the fabric of your society, must be able to move freely without arousing suspicion or curiosity. You understand, I am sure. A foreigner, even a wealthy one, faces many obstacles. I intend to overcome them through perfect preparation." The explanation was reasonable, yet something in the way he said it, the emphasis on moving unnoticed and freely, filled Jonathan with a creeping dread he couldn't articulate. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, and Jonathan became aware of subtle wrongnesses in his host's behavior. The Count never ate or drank, though he encouraged Jonathan to help himself to the refreshments that appeared periodically on the table, brought by servants Jonathan never saw. Dracula's skin remained the same pallid shade regardless of the room's temperature, never flushing with warmth or exertion. His breathing was so shallow and infrequent that Jonathan sometimes wondered if he breathed at all. And as the afternoon wore on toward evening, the Count seemed to become more animated, more energetic, as though drawing strength from the approaching darkness. When the sun finally set behind the western peaks and shadows swallowed the library, Dracula stood with an air of deep satisfaction. "Excellent work, my friend. We have accomplished much. You must be exhausted. I have arranged dinner for you in the small dining room. Tomorrow evening we shall continue." He'd paused, seemingly considering something. "I regret that my own schedule prevents me from being available during daylight hours. My affairs require my attention at night. You should consider the castle your own during the day, explore, relax, enjoy the library. Only I must ask that you not attempt to enter locked rooms. This is an ancient fortress, full of structural dangers, and I would not want my guest to come to harm in some unsafe wing. For your own protection, please respect the locked doors." It was phrased as concern, as hospitality, but Jonathan heard it for what it was, the rules of his imprisonment. He was to be confined to specific areas, prevented from exploring, kept ignorant of whatever else this castle contained. And underlying it was a threat, subtle but unmistakable: obey, or face consequences. He'd nodded agreement because what else could he do, and the Count had smiled and departed, leaving Jonathan alone in the darkening library with the maps of London spread before him like prophecies of invasion. Dinner had been a solitary affair, excellent food that tasted like dust in his mouth, served in a small room whose single window looked out over the precipice and the vast empty darkness of the mountains. He'd tried the door afterward, the one leading to the corridor he'd glimpsed beyond the inhabited portions of the castle, and found it locked as expected. He'd returned to his chamber, to the comfortable prison that was beginning to feel like a cell, and had seriously contemplated escape for the first time. The window of his room was barred, the bars old but solid, set deep into the stone. The door could be locked from outside, he'd discovered, though the Count hadn't yet exercised that option. But even if he could get into the corridors, where would he go? The main gate through which he'd entered was surely locked and guarded. The walls were sheer drops to rocks far below. The road back to civilization was hours of mountain track through wolf-infested wilderness. He had no horse, no weapon, no knowledge of the terrain. Escape was impossible, at least for now, and that realization settled over him with the weight of a gravestone. He'd lain in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the castle's night sounds, and had been drifting toward uneasy sleep when he'd heard it. A woman's voice, singing softly somewhere in the fortress, the melody wordless and haunting and deeply melancholy. It had called to something in him, that voice, a loneliness that matched his own, and before rational thought could intervene he'd found himself out of bed, pulling on his robe, lighting a candle, opening his door to peer into the corridor. The singing came from somewhere deeper in the castle, from the direction of the locked door, but when he'd approached he'd found it standing open, darkness beyond, the woman's voice drifting up from that darkness like smoke. An invitation or a trap, he couldn't tell which, but the isolation of his situation, the desperate need to know he wasn't entirely alone in this place, had pulled him forward. He'd stepped through the doorway into a part of the castle he hadn't yet seen, older and more ruinous than the sections the Count maintained, with crumbling plaster exposing the stone beneath and moonlight streaming through gaps in the walls. The corridor led to a winding stair that descended into the mountain itself, carved from living rock, and the singing grew stronger as he descended, multiple voices now, harmonizing in a way that shouldn't have been beautiful but was eerily and hypnotically beautiful. At the bottom of the stair was a chamber, once grand but now fallen into decay, its vaulted ceiling partially collapsed, moonlight pouring through the gaps to illuminate a space that had the feeling of a tomb or crypt. Ancient furniture draped in rotting cloth, tapestries hanging in shreds, and in the center of the room, a raised dais where 3 figures reclined on what appeared to be stone sarcophagi. Jonathan had known he should run, should flee back up the stairs to his room, but he'd found himself rooted to the spot, paralyzed by their collective gaze. They were beautiful beyond any standard he'd known, their features perfect, their movements as they rose from their stone beds fluid and graceful, but there was something wrong about them, the same wrongness he'd sensed in the Count but amplified, more obvious. Their skin was too pale, luminous in the moonlight like phosphorescence. Their eyes were too bright, too intense, inhuman in their hunger. And when they moved toward him, gliding rather than walking, he'd seen that they cast shadows in the moonlight, but those shadows were wrong, distorted, suggesting shapes that didn't match their human appearance. "What's your name, sweet boy?" the second woman had asked, circling to his left while the third moved right, surrounding him in a slow predatory dance. "Tell us your name. Tell us why you've come to our master's house. Tell us if you taste as sweet as you smell." "Jonathan," he'd managed, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm Jonathan Harker. I came on business. Legal business. Property transfers. I'm a solicitor's clerk." The words sounded absurd spoken aloud, the mundane reality of his profession crashing against the unreality of this moment, of being surrounded by 3 women who looked at him like he was meat, like prey, like something to be consumed. The third woman had laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "A solicitor's clerk. How wonderfully modern. How perfectly ordinary. And you've fallen into our world, haven't you, poor thing? Fallen into the darkness, and now you can't find your way back to the light. The master has plans for you, we can smell it on you, his mark, his claim. But he's not here right now, is he? He's hunting in the valley, feeding on shepherd boys and village girls, and we are here, and we are so very hungry." She'd reached out, her hand cool against his cheek, and Jonathan had felt his knees weaken, his body responding to her touch despite the terror screaming in his mind. There was something intoxicating about them, a seductive pull that went beyond mere physical attraction, something that spoke to a deep instinctive part of him that wanted to surrender, to let them do whatever they wished, to give himself over to the terrible pleasure promised in their eyes. "We could make you forget," the first woman whispered, close enough now that he could feel her breath against his neck, cold as winter air. "All your fear, all your worry about escape and survival. We could make you feel things you've never imagined, take you to heights of ecstasy your little mortal frame can barely contain. All we ask in return is a small drink, just a taste of the life flowing through your veins. You'd barely notice. You might even enjoy it. Most do, in the end." Her lips had brushed his throat, and Jonathan had felt a sharp scratch, the edge of teeth that were too sharp, too long, and the sensation had snapped something in him, had broken through the seductive fog and replaced it with pure animal terror. He'd shoved her away with strength born of desperation, had stumbled backward, hand going to the crucifix beneath his nightshirt, and the moment his fingers closed around the silver cross the 3 women had recoiled as if struck. "He has the old protections," the second woman hissed, her beautiful face twisting into something monstrous for just an instant, revealing the predator beneath the seductive facade. "Faith-marked. Spoiled meat. The master will be angry if we take what is claimed." "The master isn't here," the first woman said, recovering her composure but keeping her distance from the crucifix now visible in Jonathan's trembling hand. "And I am so hungry, sisters. It's been months since he brought us anything fresh. We survive on scraps, on the dregs of his feeding, while he plans his great migration to the west. I say we take this one. Let him rage when he returns. What can he do? Kill us. We're already dead. They'd begun to advance again, more cautiously now, circling like wolves, and Jonathan had backed toward the stair, holding the crucifix before him like a talisman, praying without words that it would continue to hold them at bay. The third woman had laughed again, that terrible breaking glass sound. Run, little solicitor. Run back to your comfortable room. But you can't stay there forever. Eventually the master will tire of you, will drain you or turn you or simply dispose of you, and when that happens, we'll be waiting. We're patient. We've learned patience over the centuries. What's a few more nights when we've waited so long already? He'd reached the stair and had turned to flee, taking the steps two at a time, hearing them follow but slowly, toying with him, their laughter echoing up the stone shaft. He'd burst through the door at the top, had slammed it behind him, and had been fumbling for some way to lock or bar it when a voice had spoken from the shadows of the corridor. "So you've met my brides." Jonathan had spun to find the Count standing in the darkness, his eyes glowing with that same inner light, his expression unreadable. How long he'd been there, whether he'd known Jonathan would explore the forbidden wing or had returned to find him gone, Jonathan couldn't tell. But the Count's presence was somehow more terrifying than the women below, carrying an authority and power that made them seem like children by comparison. "I told you not to open locked doors," Dracula said softly, moving closer with that gliding predatory grace. "I warned you that some parts of this castle are dangerous. Did you think I spoke in metaphor? Those three have been with me for a very long time, and their hunger is not easily controlled. You're fortunate you had the protection. Fortunate that they feared my wrath more than they desired your blood. But fortune is a finite resource, Mr. Harker. It runs out eventually." He'd stopped directly before Jonathan, towering over him, and his hand had shot out with that supernatural speed to grip Jonathan's shoulder, the pressure immense, painful, grinding bones together. "You are my guest, but you are also my tool, my means to an end. The work we do together serves my purposes. When those purposes are fulfilled, when I have learned everything I need to know about London and your modern world, when the properties are transferred and my boxes are shipped and everything is in place for my arrival in England, then your usefulness ends. Do you understand what that means?" Jonathan had understood perfectly. It meant he was living on borrowed time, that the moment the Count no longer needed him was the moment he became expendable, food for the creatures below or a corpse at the bottom of the precipice. Dracula had seen the understanding in his eyes and had smiled with something almost like approval. "Good. You're not stupid. I chose well when I selected your firm. Now, return to your room. Sleep if you can. Tomorrow evening we continue our work, and the evening after that, and for as many evenings as necessary until every detail is perfect. And do not, under any circumstances, venture into the locked wings again. My brides are restrained by my command, but their restraint has limits. Next time, your little cross may not be enough to save you." He'd released Jonathan and stepped back, and Jonathan had fled to his chamber, had locked the door though he knew the lock was meaningless, had huddled on his bed with the crucifix clutched against his chest and waited for dawn like a drowning man waiting for air. The singing had started again some time before morning, the three voices harmonizing in that haunting wordless melody, and underneath it he'd heard other sounds, rhythmic and organic, like the movement of bodies or the feeding of beasts, and he'd pressed his hands over his ears and tried not to imagine what was happening in the depths of the castle. When dawn finally came, grey light seeping through his window, the singing had stopped and the castle had fallen into an unnatural silence, as though everything within it had died or fallen into some deep unnatural sleep. Jonathan had risen on shaking legs, had washed and dressed, and had stood at his window looking out over the mountains, trying to calculate the distance to the ground below, wondering if jumping might be preferable to waiting for the inevitable night when the Count's patience expired and he found himself drained and dead, another victim in a castle that reeked of death. But he was still alive. That was the essential fact. Still alive, still breathing, still capable of thought and action. The Count needed him for something, needed his knowledge and expertise, and as long as that remained true, he had time. Time to plan, to prepare, to find some way out of this nightmare. He thought of Mina, waiting for him in London, unaware of his situation, believing him to be on a routine business trip. He thought of his life, ordinary and unremarkable perhaps, but his own, full of small joys and future possibilities. He thought of the Count's plans for London, for bringing his darkness to the crowded streets and teeming neighborhoods where millions of innocent people lived and worked, unknowing and vulnerable. He couldn't let that happen. Somehow, impossibly, he had to survive this place, had to escape, had to warn someone about what was coming. The task seemed impossible, the odds overwhelmingly against him, but what choice did he have? Surrender was death. Compliance was death. Only resistance, only the desperate hope that he could find some weakness, some opportunity, some way to turn the situation to his advantage, offered any chance at all. Jonathan Harker squared his shoulders, pressed the crucifix to his lips in a prayer to a God who seemed very distant from this haunted place, and made a decision. He would survive. He would document everything, would learn everything he could about the Count and his nature and his plans. He would play the role of compliant assistant while secretly searching for a way out. And if he found that way, if some miracle granted him escape, he would make sure the world knew what was coming, would make sure someone was prepared to stop the ancient evil that planned to feast on modern London. It was a thin hope, barely more than desperation wearing the mask of determination, but it was all he had. And as the morning strengthened and the castle began to feel slightly less oppressive in the sunlight, Jonathan sat at the small desk in his room and began to write, documenting everything that had happened, every detail of his imprisonment, creating a record that might outlive him if he didn't outlive this place. Outside his window, far below, something that might have been a large wolf or might have been something else prowled the rocky slopes, and high above, in a tower whose windows were bricked shut from within, 3 voices began singing again, soft and hungry, waiting for night. The game had begun in earnest now, predator and prey circling each other in the ancient dance, and only one truth was certain. Before this was over, blood would be spilled, lives would end, and the darkness that had slumbered in these mountains for centuries was preparing to wake and spread across the world like a plague. Jonathan dipped his pen in ink and continued writing, racing against time he didn't have, fighting an enemy he couldn't defeat, sustained by nothing more than the stubborn human refusal to accept the inevitable. And in the depths of the castle, in chambers where sunlight never reached, Count Dracula slept the sleep of the undead in a box filled with his native soil, dreaming dreams of London, of fog-shrouded streets and warm blood flowing freely, of an empire of night he would build in the heart of the modern world, and of the solicitor's clerk whose knowledge would make it all possible and whose death, when it came, would be the beginning of a new age of darkness. The bride slept too, in their stone beds, belly still hungry, lips still red, waiting with the patience of the damned for the moment when their master's protection would lift and the young man upstairs would be theirs to drain and devour. And far away in London, Mina Murray woke from another nightmare about shadows and blood, her heart racing, Jonathan's name on her lips, knowing without knowing that something terrible was happening to the man she loved, powerless to help him, able only to wait and hope and fear. The pieces were moving into position, the stage was set, and the tragedy that would unfold across 2 nations and claim innocent lives and transform the living into the undead was beginning its inexorable progression. There would be blood before it ended. There would be madness and sacrifice and death. But there would also be resistance, courage, love strong enough to fight the darkness. The story was only beginning.